Hi guys, just a quick heads up that I'm changing up the format of the podcast for a few episodes. I've been getting so much inquiry from young adults who are deeply frustrated with a lot of aspects of wealth building in today's environment. So I have invited my good friend Ken Huang, who is a millennial, to come join me to have some candid conversation about what's happening today and really kind of share lessons and experiences that I've had along the way that I hope will be helpful to you. Please enjoy these wide-ranging and uncensored conversations. Ken, I reckon making your first million is super... Oh, you don't want me to say it's hard?
Just because, I think the feeling is that it's like, oh...
Hey, Ken, I was talking to my husband over the last couple of weeks, and we had this fabulous conversation which unearthed some of the things that we went through when we were in our early 30s to get to that first million. And I'd love to share some of those with you today because I think they'd be super valuable for people.
I'd love to. Well, let's get into it. I think there are 5 lessons. So what's the first one?
Yeah. So look, neither of us came from money and neither of us actually had any good advice from our parents when it came to, well, what should we be doing and where should we be investing our money? You know, they were a generation of just save. And so the thing that I think we both learned through osmosis was you must course correct. I think building wealth is not this set and forget exercise. And I think that's what I thought. If you think about the generation that I grew up in, it involved taking all your money, either giving it to somebody else and saying, give it back to me in 45 years when I need it for retirement, or it's just you put your money into various shares and then you forget about it. And what I actually think we learned the hard way through a bunch of cuts and bruises in that first 2, 3, 4 years was that it is a constant review of what's working and what's not working, and being okay with adjusting your strategies and seeing the mistakes and recognizing where you've gone off track. And, you know, I think there's a great expression by Tony Robbins, which is, in life, you either need inspiration or desperation. And I think there was definitely, you know, we would oscillate between those two things, but absolutely just constantly coming back to, what are we trying to do? Like, what are we trying to do? Like, we made this mistake or we've ended up buying this thing that hasn't really gone the way we thought. And so I think that idea of constantly course correcting is definitely something that, you know, I would hope that I would be able to share that with my own kids, that you're not going to always get it right first time. Sometimes you've got to just constantly tweak and recalibrate.
I guess I feel like I've mentioned this to you in the same call that we had, was the Japanese concept of Kaizen. And that is just incremental, either improvement or adjustments to a craft or a workmanship. That's how they sort of contextually think about that. But that could be anything from like waking up in the morning and today I'm going to start making my bed. And then tomorrow it's like, I'll make sure that, my clothes are ironed. And the next day is like this and that. And so I feel like there's some similarities there. Well, this is at least the way that I'm interpreting it, which is you're not supposed to have the perfect scenario each time you pull the trigger, whether it's investing or wealth building. But it's the idea of like going, okay, what have I noticed that I need to actually adjust and correct along this way, rather than going, hey, like I've got to have the home run every single time a decision's made, or potentially to go, hey, it's like just a set and forget. And I just don't look at it for, like you said, 30 or 40 years.
I think it's worse than that, Ken. I think the modern society especially portrays this idea that building a wealth is this nice curve to success. And I think it's lots of divots and lots of ups and downs as you go. And I think if I'd had that expectation from the beginning, I think I would have saved myself a lot of heartache, because essentially, having now been at the other end and coaching people, who are getting started, I see that it is absolutely the most natural thing to get off course, to make mistakes, to need to refine. I think it's very rare to stumble across people who build wealth mistake-free and have no need for course correction. So I think there's a little bit of expectation management there.
I guess the point here is it's quite normal to make mistakes, particularly making that first million.
Yeah, 100%. Like I think 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yep.
And, I've said this before, like to some degree, building wealth is like watching paint dry. If you're not trying to be like, overnight success and make your $1 million in like a year, which I know is something that everyone aspires to, but would be nice, but it's just not, it's not practical. So, you've got to actually recognize that you're sort of setting yourself up for this really long race, the big race, and you've got your compass and you just want to be constantly refining.
Well, I guess the marathon versus the sprint, right? You don't want to sprint in the first kilometer of the race and then you burn yourself out for the rest of the marathon. So you've got to be smart about it and pace yourself out. What's lesson number 2?
The second lesson that we chatted about was looking for cheap lessons. And I know that sounds bad, but the big learning was that you don't have to make all the mistakes yourself. You can actually look at the experience of others. So we always used to joke with our kids, there's an easy way and a hard way to learn things. The easy way is to see that it didn't work out for someone over there and take the lesson. Or you can be that person who just feels like, you've got to go through baptism of fire on every single aspect of the journey. So when I talk about cheap lessons, and I probably took, I think, a good 5-6 years to learn this after I really started to try and build wealth. There were mentors that could have saved me lots of money. There were books I could read. But the idea was like, there are people who can give you insights and shortcuts to wealth building. And so that idea of learning the hard way or the easy way, sometimes you actually have to just play and practice. But I think there's a lot that you can do around this idea of find people who have the results that you want, study them, talk to them, read great books that open your mind to new ways of thinking, and then implement as much as you can. I know this sounds funny, but it's almost like it's overlooked. It's just easy to take the shiny object that we see on socials and think that that's the right way to do things. This is a question of kind of looking for cheap lessons, but doing it with a bit of a lens of, is it real? Is it not real?
What about lesson number 3?
Lesson 3. So this one was one, again, that I think is actually really challenging, but sounds really easy, which is to curb your appetite to spend. When I started my career very early on, I went overseas and I lived in London, New York, Hong Kong, and it was so easy to get swept into the spending money on experiences and restaurants and clothes. And one of the things I learned when I came back to Australia, I thought money's just always going to be this easy. And then suddenly it wasn't. And so there was a very harsh lesson there initially. But the more I started to learn about the possibility of what financial independence looked like, the pain around kind of curbing my appetite to spend just evaporated. It became super easy. So, there's an expression, you can be hot or you can be hot and bothered. And I think the same goes with money. You can be mindful about your spending and be in pain around it and feel frustrated and feel like you're missing out, or you can just be not that bothered by it because your eye is on the prize of what you want in the future. So I think a little bit of my fear of being broke was what initially forced me into minimizing my spending. But I think ultimately, I tell this joke of when I'm trying to explain to people about curbing their spending that, I would allocate. And one of the things that happened on many occasions was I'd turn up to the supermarket, I'd have a trolley full of groceries and my card wouldn't work because I'd overspent somewhere else. And I just was so unashamed about that, just going, oh, sorry, I can't take that, or just not bothered by it at all. And so I think this lesson around learning to curb your appetite to spend, it's the most simple lesson, but I actually think it's the hardest one to execute on.
Well, as you were saying that as well, the thing that also came to mind was if you don't know how you're going to get to your destination, then of course, trying to cut down and make these decisions to get there is going to be even harder, right? I sort of use the weight loss example again, is if you don't know what exercise you need to do and how to actually eat well, it's going to be really hard for you to actually make a decision to, try and lose weight or get fitter as well. I think the same thing is quite similar in money, which is, well, if you don't know what the steps are in order for you to get to there, meaning, if you want to be earning a certain amount or you need to be investing or have a net wealth by this amount or this much passive income from your assets, then you have no hope of understanding what are the first initial steps that you need to take to be able to get there as well. And so depriving yourself, I guess, which is probably what people feel like, whether it's weight loss or if it's curbing your spending, is really difficult because you don't know how to get to, the end prize as well. But yeah, that's just sort of how I interpreted it.
Yeah. And that's why I think pairing that with the one before, which is if you've got guides to kind of light the path for you and make that a really clear, this is all you got to do and you'll get where you want to go, then it's much easier to make that decision. Because your values shift. I have to tell this because it was such a great story. One of our members in our community this morning, when I first met him, was expressing a burning desire to own a Porsche. Basically, the guy can afford it. That's the bottom line. But for various reasons, he had, I can't buy that. He was in agony about the guilt of spending money on a Porsche when he hadn't hit the financial aspirations that he had. And today, just out of the blue, he shares, I don't want the Porsche anymore. This journey to financial independence is so much more fun for me now. And I'm so engaged in it because I can see that this effort equals this outcome. And we were all like, we thought it was just fantastic, but it was just a funny, like I said, dude, you can do both. They're not mutually exclusive. But when you're earlier on in your journey, you got to make those tough calls.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a relatable example because I definitely would still want the Porsche, especially if I had the money for it. But I suppose, interests and habits also change over time as well. And maybe what the North Star was when he first started is actually different now, right? Like things evolve and change.
That was the exact conversation. The exact conversation we were having was that as your net worth grows and your means grows, for some reason, your appetite to accumulate more stuff actually diminishes. And you're not really sure why. It's not because you don't appreciate those things, and it's not because you're so frugal that you have pain around spending. It's more just...
You just understand you don't really need it, right?
And you don't really need it. What you value is health, connection, love, community, all these other things.
Definitely. What's the next lesson?
Lesson number 3 was, we're up to 3 or 4?
4, yep.
Lesson number 4 was seek balance in your investing. So one of the things I felt that happened very early on in my journey was people kind of in my ear telling me what sorts of investments I should be doing. You should be buying this, or you should be doing this, and this will make you the most money. And often from people who didn't necessarily have the results that I actually wanted, but were kind of on the journey themselves. And like, for example, one of the things that was talked about and is still talked about is go out and buy the best blue chip property that you can. But I realized very early on, when you have finite income, and in fact, I would argue I had very modest income, then doing those sorts of strategies just doesn't work. It causes too much stress. So the idea that John and I were talking about was this idea of seeking balance. You almost have to, the metaphor I would use is you're trying to climb out of a well, a really deep well that's slippery. And so you want to get like little footholds. The journey to the top of the well is as comfortable as it can be. If you start carrying boulders on your back as you're trying to climb out of that well, it just puts too much stress. So there were a bunch of strategies, especially around real estate, that I tried that just put us under such an enormous load. And the thing about real estate is it's such a big asset class. You can turn any ship around, but if you make mistakes with high value assets like that, it's just a big burden to carry for a period of time. And it basically you lose time. My journey to where I am could have been so much more simple and direct, but I made a few blunders along the way in terms of listening to people I shouldn't have listened to, chasing returns because I thought it would get me where I wanted to go faster without taking into consideration, like, can I carry this? Is this actually going to be comfortable for me? I think everyone will try and sell you on their version of how to get rich quick. You have to create, and I think this is a little bit around intuition, but you have to create an internal filter, which is to ask yourself the question, is that right for me? So if I buy that investment and I'm carrying this negative cash flow, or it exposes me to this kind of vulnerability, like if the economy tanks, I'm screwed, like those sorts of things, you need to ask yourself, is that the right strategy for me for now? And so that balance piece is more around comfort on the journey.
Can you give an example of, sort of an investment deal that really put you under the pump and you didn't find balance in it whatsoever?
I think it was the second or third investment property we bought in Melbourne. It was specifically to do as a development. What we hadn't realized was how much cost was involved in getting to each stage of the development. So, it was $4,000 for this consultant. Then it was going to be this, then it was this, then it was this. And so all we were shown was like, this is how much money you'll make at the end. And it'll take you roughly 12 months to 18 months to do it. It ended up taking us 4.5 years to develop that in the way that we were told we should do it. And it was because we just couldn't afford to carry it. We just couldn't afford all the different steps along the way. You just got to be really careful, like in hindsight. And in the end, I'll tell you what happened. We ended up with these 2 units that were worth a lot. We made a fabulous profit on it, an amazing profit, but we could barely afford to keep the properties. And so, it was one of these, like, it didn't really work out on so many levels the way that we thought it would. And, to be honest, we nearly choked a few times where we nearly lost the whole lot.
Wow. And so it's like in those situations, it was more about also sleep at night factor, just the stress or the cloud that was hanging over your heads just to try and support this asset, as opposed to having something that may not be as lucrative or, profitable, but at the same time, you can sort of get on with your day and not really sort of stress out about it too much.
Yeah, like one of the decisions I made very early on was to not buy blue chip real estate, or not all blue chip real estate in the big cities, but to move to sort of satellite, large regional centers. And in the end, and a lot of people went, oh, you won't make as much money. I tell you, some of those deals have ended up being the most lucrative, profitable deals, and they cost me virtually no cash flow on the journey. Like they put money in my pocket.
So either positively geared or very close to that.
Yeah. Like I don't need them to put a lot of money in my pocket. I just don't need them to be a rock on my back.
Got it.
And that's for me, if I were going to do it again, I would be so much more conscious of comfort than I was. I mean, I think John and I redlined our finances for a very long time and made life very uncomfortable. And I don't think that was necessary.
All right. And what's the last lesson?
Last lesson was lesson number 5, selecting one interim goal at a time. So this is a super valuable lesson for people who want it all and they want it now. If you think about all the types of financial goals you can have savings goals, learning goals, buying goals, investing goals. It's about kind of saying, setting a priority and a plan around that set of values or priorities. And I know I say this like a broken record. You can have it all. You can't just have it all at once. So it's very hard to say, well, I want to set a savings goal to buy my first piece of real estate. And at the same time, I want to be investing in all this other stuff as well. Like it's just, sometimes you can do it all, but sometimes when you do it all, you dilute the impact of your ability to make incremental gains. And so I think I had a little bit of that going on when I was getting started. I wanted it all. I wanted to be able to save for the big deals and do developments and things like that. And I wanted to invest at the same time. And I wanted to invest in, alternative real estate and. And I think it was a very painful but, necessary sort of learning to become much more strategic. And how do I play this game of chess and get the next best move happening instead of trying to play 10 games of chess at the same time?
Yeah. I saw Alex Hormozy show this visually, and I think what he did was basically had all these cups lined up and he started saying, right, like this is your jug and this is all the sort of focus and attention you can give something. And he started saying, look, if you divide your attention and your bandwidth towards multiple things, people talk about, how I earned 7 different streams of income, or how I, managed to set up 12 businesses and they all make me this much amount of money. Instead, the reality is that you're better off focusing on one thing and getting really, really good at that one thing, as opposed to trying to do 7 or 8 things at the same time, because you only have a finite number of resources. In this case, his metaphor was water, which is the equivalent of time and focus. And sort of as he was explaining, he was pouring it into individual cups. And you can see there that you just can't give your full attention to anything because you have divided focus. And I think that same lesson rings true in terms of what you're saying is why don't you just focus on just the one thing, get that done, right, before you move on to the next thing, instead of trying to go, right, why don't we just do all 5 things at the same time, which I've actually been guilty of in many ways, not necessarily in investing, but maybe in the game of business. But I had to learn that the hard way because I realized I was like, well, if I tried to do 5 different things, I'm not going to do any of them well. Whereas if I just focus on the one thing, that will sort of, I guess, exponentially do better than, the 5 things doing okay.
I think we've already used this quote, but the Bruce Lee, fear not the man who knows 10,000 kicks, fear the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times. And I would say it's actually what I've become known for is being a really good strategist. But I would actually say it's not an attribute that I was naturally gifted with. I actually had to work really hard, patience as well. You have to pair all of that with a nice bow, that we call patience, because if you can only do one thing at a time and that the wheels move slowly with your wealth building, but you're very clear on what you want, then patience has to follow. You have to be very patient. But I would actually say that becoming strategic in your thinking is just a natural byproduct of recognizing that just one interim goal at a time. So super important wealth building piece for anyone who's serious about building wealth, and yet so missed in mainstream conversation.
Definitely. Because I think, from our good friend Vin Jang, he talks about, he's a magician. So he sort of talks about there's 2 aspects to a really great magician, and 99% of books that he's read focus on technical, I guess, understanding of how to do magic. That's like your sleight of hands, how the trick works, all the different angles and things like that. But very little people actually teach about showmanship. And so how that sort of correlates to what you're saying here is I think a lot of people focus on what's the sort of silver bullet, what's the big chess move that you can do to make it checkmate, what are the things that you can sort of what are all the options opportunities that are out there. But no one out there is actually teaching potentially the mindset behind what it takes to actually build genuine wealth, like patience, understanding to not focus on shiny objects, doing one thing at a time, which is what you're advocating here. It's because it's not sexy. People don't want to know that sort of stuff. And so I would argue that you say, oh, you're a really good strategist. I would also say it's like there is a huge component of EQ, mindset management when it comes to building wealth that I think people are their own worst enemies when it comes to building wealth. They make decisions that fly in the face of their own self-interest because they think that's the thing that you've got to do as well. And so I've been someone who has been in that position as well. And it wasn't until someone, I guess, unveiled or really sort of pointed out to me these sort of things did I realize, because you don't know what you don't know. You know, you talk about unconscious incompetence. That's basically what it was. So yeah, I guess that's the last thing I'll say about this, which is all of these lessons that you're distilling down. I think people are looking for like, what's that sort of big move or those things? But in actual fact, it's like, well, how do I need to think about things? How do I need to approach problems? And what are the sort of the things I need to consider in order for me to make the right decisions? Because there's no one way or one pathway to be able to get to where you want to get to. There's multiple ways to get there. You just got to have the ability to identify what's best for you.
That was gold, Ken. And I would say to that, if you think about it from the investing, like the actual investing part of the wealth building journey, if you talk to most people, they're interested in exactly what you're saying. What is the one killer deal that I can get my hands on today that's going to get me most of the way there? It's the wrong thinking. The right thinking is, what are the consistent efforts that I can make in deals that give me a reasonable return that are actually going to move the needle and take me further along on my journey. And, you know, my final thoughts on all of this, if you're going to put a bow around it, is consistency will always trump flashes of brilliance. Always. No question. So people need to stop looking for killer deals. Like, they waste so much time looking for killer deals and start focusing on consistent efforts. If you're